Hello, today I want to show you one of the techniques I use when painting scale models with an airbrush. It is a type of pre-shading technique with a black base, white highlights, and the same layer of final color. Here's an example of finished results. If you look closely, the surface is not completely flat. Some areas are brighter, while some areas around rivets, edge, small details stay a little darker. And this difference is not very strong, but it gives the model more depth. For someone who just started using an airbrush, this technique may look complicated, but the basic process is actually simple. I divide it into three steps. Create a black base, adding the white highlights, and slowly building up the final color. First, I start with a black base. For this step, I normally use an airbrush with a 0.3mm nozzle. I recommend 0.3mm for the most general painting. It gives you a wider spray area, so it is easier to cover a large space. Before spraying the model, I normally test the airbrush on a piece of paper or another spare surface. I want to make sure that paint comes out smoothly. If the spray suddenly stops, spits large drops, or gives me an uneven line, I would rather find a problem before I point the airbrush at the model. Then, I spray the entire model black. I do not try to cover everything with one very heavy layer. I move the airbrush across the surface and slowly build up the black color until it looks even. At this point, the model looks completely dark, but that is intentional. Instead of adding dark shadow later, I'm starting with the shadows already covering the whole surface. This gives me a dark base that I can slowly brighten up the next step. The second step is adding white highlights. For this part, I prefer a smaller 0.2mm nozzle. The small nozzle gives me more control while I'm working on close to rivets and other small details. I do not want to spray the entire surface white. Instead, I mainly spray the center of the large areas. I leave some of the original black visible around the rivets, edges, corners, and recessed details. The airbrush also does not need to be extremely close to the model. I normally begin with a little distance and move closer only when I need a smaller and more controlled area. This makes it easier to avoid sudden spraying a large white spot. Here you can see what the model looks like during this stage. It can look a little strange. Some areas are almost white, some areas can be very dark. The pattern may look uneven. For beginner, this is an important point. It doesn't need to be look perfect at this stage. Most of the contrast will be covered by the final color. The purpose of the white paint is simply decide which part of the model should be appear brighter later. I usually build up the white slowly. If one area looks too dark, I can always spray a little more white. But if I immediately make everything completely white, I'll lose the black base underneath. So I prefer to stop, look at the model, and then decide where I need to be more highlighted. The third step is applying the main color. For this step, I normally return to the 0.3mm nozzle. Now I want a wider and more even spray again. This is probably the most important part of the whole process. The goal is not to cover the black and white pattern as quick as possible. Instead, I spray the main color in several thin layers. After the first layer, the model may look still very black and white. It is normal. After the second layer, the difference becomes smoother. And after another layer, the surface begin looks like one color, but the highlight and dark areas can still be seen underneath. This is why I like this technique. I can control the final result while I'm painting. If I want a stronger shadow and more contrast, I stop earlier. If I want a cleaner and more subtle result, I add another thin layer. There is no exact number of layers that works every time. Different colors color differently, and different models may need different effects. And this technique offers me a very detailed control of what final result I want. So the full process is actually very simple. First, use 0.3mm airbrush to create a even black base. Second, Use a 0.2 mm airbrush to add controlled white highlights while keep the areas around rivets and small details darker. Finally, return to 0.3 mm airbrush and slowly build up the main color until the contrast looks right. For beginner, I think it is useful technique because you do not need to create a perfect final shadow with one difficult spray. You create a light and dark area first, and then you slowly control how much of them remain visible.